Hi everyone, welcome to a rainy episode of the What Comes to Mind series. Today is episode 21 and we're going to be talking about toxins. It'll be quite a good video. Now the word toxin has quite a few different definitions, but we'll go through them now to help us understand truly what is an actual toxin. Now generally it's seen as a poisonous substance secreted from either bacteria, plants, animals. Within that we have the term toxic. And related to what I've just mentioned, the word toxic is about something that causes some debilitating effects, some very harmful effects to the host, and generally it's ourselves. So toxin is something that is harmful, has some debilitating effects, can be from animals, plants, or even bacteria, and as we unfortunately know, viruses. And to add, the other kind of definition is something that is harmful, whether it's ingested, inhaled, injected, or absorbed. So toxin is kind of like, these are the ways it can cause harm. So we go through injected, ingested, inhaled, or absorbed. Now before I go into toxins and what comes to mind when I do think of toxins, is I want to take this moment to remind myself and those who are watching that the more we try and arm ourselves with beneficial knowledge, the better position we are in to try and improve ourselves and those around us. But often the other side is we need reminding. We constantly need to remind. And that's what sometimes a lot of these videos are as well. You may know some of the information, but being reminded by somebody can also push us in a positive way to try and improve ourselves in some form of capacity. Now, toxins. To think there are thousands and thousands of man-made chemicals that are released into the air, into our kind of society, our agricultural ecology, and only a fraction of them have actually been studied to see of their beneficial, or more often not, their harmful effects on our bodies. You know, figures are around about 80 to 90,000 chemicals a year. We probably only studied maybe 5 or 6,000. And this gives you an idea of the huge uncertainty around chemicals per se, and naturally by default, many of them are toxic, i.e. toxin. Now there are many different categories of toxins, but the four main ones are chemical toxins, biological, physical toxins, and then radiation forms of toxins. But with these categories, I'm going to supersede them with kind of more real life examples that we are more familiar with, so we can relate this discussion back to our home and how we live our lives. So hopefully, again, as I normally do, they are timestamped in the description box below, so feel free to go back and forth if you are taking notes or if you want to remind yourself of the beneficial information I am trying to share. So now let's start off with chemical toxins. Now we often find them in foods, in toiletries and cosmetics. But before I go into those classic examples, I want to talk about some historical chemical toxins that literally gives you an idea of the sheer devastating effects toxins can actually have. Not just us as individuals, but actual society as a whole. Now the first historical toxin I do want to talk about is something known as Agent Orange. It's under the family of something known as rainbow herbicides, and it was used as a chemical warfare tactic in the Vietnam War. Between 1961 and 1971, this actual chemical was used to cause devastating effects in Vietnam. And before I go into what it is, some of the effects are still faced now, where the actual, you can say, chemical known as dioxin can be passed on to children, and some of them still have these deformities, huge complications in terms of forms of cancer, respiratory disease, Parkinson's, from a chemical used as a potential herbicide. And it gives you an indication of how toxins were used in kind of weaponized situations. And chemical warfare was a classic example of the devastating effects toxins were. Now, Agent Orange was a mixture of certain chemicals, but a key harmful ingredient was something known as dioxins. And the reason why I wanted to start with this is, we now know, you can see over here, the actual long name. I actually used something known as 1,4-dioxin when I was doing my PhD at the start to make certain drugs. And then it occurred to me as a little bit of a problematic situation, a bit of a dilemma. And that dilemma was, I was using carcinogens as chemicals to make an anti-cancer drug. And many people do, and many pharmaceutical interests need to, in order to make those drugs that are beneficial. But that thought came into my mind, but I'm using something that causes cancer to make a drug to stop cancer, if that makes sense. You know, and in the medicinal chemistry world, there are many harmful chemicals that I have to take care of. But back then, it just occurred to me that, wait, this is a bit weird, you know. But going back to Agent Orange, it's incredible to think that a little molecule like that causes devastating effects that are still felt now, 10s and 20 years later. That's a toxin. That is a toxin. Now, another historical toxin, or a group of them, are known as BTEX. Now, I'll mention what that is in a minute. Now, these group of chemicals were kind of found in wastewater during many industrial kind of processes, and still now, of course. But back when there was a huge industrial boom, industrial age, back then there was not known the effects that these groups of chemicals would cause. Nowadays, many people are studying. One of them, actually, my friend, who did a PhD on studying these chemicals in wastewater. BTEX, it stands for benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylene. All these enes, and these are something known as polyaromatic hydrocarbons. They are carcinogens. They can cause all sorts of things, but the main area is that they are carcinogens. They are found in effluents and wastewater from industrial processes. So whether it's from textile industries, manufacturing, the wastewater that can occur from those, even food industries. Some of these processing chemicals are found in wastewater, and they can affect ecology. They can also affect humans in terms of drinking water. That's why there are scientists who look at wastewater treatment to try and remove these toxins from the water, because we know we need water to survive. It's an essential part of life, and we don't want toxins like BTEX in there. So that's one of those environmental toxins that environmental chemists focus on, you know. And to go into it, remember BTEX, I want to test you later. 4 things: benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylene. All enes though, all enes. Food related chemical toxins. Let's start with toiletries and cosmetics. Now, that industry is starting to get better in terms of removing certain chemicals that are really harmful, but there are some that are key and still found in the back of the label. You'll see these terms. Now, one is known as parabens. Now, these parabens are actually known as preservatives, but they are something called estrogen mimickers. And what that actually means is, if you think about breast cancer, and one of the main causes of breast cancer is, you know, kind of overstimulation of the estrogen receptors. There's certain foods and certain chemicals, just like parabens, that mimic estrogen in the body. So they can overstimulate or overactivate those receptors that, if left chronically upregulated, can lead to forms of breast cancer. Another one is phthalates. If I pronounce it right, I'm not sure, but you see it here so you can read it out for yourselves. They're actually seen as plasticizers to help things become more kind of bendy and flexible. However, they are also carcinogens, but we are happy to bathe in them, use them in certain products, and that's something over time can lead to a lot of problems. Now, these are not saying that if you have this, you will have a problem, but you increase your risk. And in terms of common sense and logic, we want to try and reduce our risks of toxins in our body that can cause harm later on. And me, an advocate of preventing the preventable, do we actually need to have those essentially in our lifestyle, or can we actually avoid them? I would actually go with the latter. I'm sure you'll agree. Now, in terms of food chemicals, there are a lot of hundreds of chemicals added to increase taste or texture, or preservatives to increase long life. And we see them, all sorts of funny names we hear and see on the back of food label packets. But a lot of them are related to something I mentioned earlier, known as polyaromatic hydrocarbons. We've got flavor enhancers, we've got things, as I mentioned, that increase taste. But a lot of them are preservatives or additives, food additives, that we essentially don't need. And it's not like if you have a packet, you're doomed. It's that notion of chronic accumulation, that over time, when you get older, you may see the effects of consuming these kind of food additives potentially over time. But another one is refined sugar. This is an interesting one because it's in tons of food, understandably, but many do deem it as the actual toxin because it does fit that principle I mentioned earlier of harming the body. Can we live without it? Potentially, yes. So I want to hear your thoughts on that notion of, would you class refined sugar as a toxin or just as something that we consume? Love to hear your thoughts on that one. Now, in terms of historical toxins, the term Yersinia pestis probably doesn't mean anything to you. But if I talk about its more commonly name, the bubonic plague, it's now a lot more prevalent, a lot more easy to remember. Now, in 1346 to 1353, the bubonic plague caused all sorts of problems around the world. And to think of devastation in terms of its effects to the body, huge irritants, all sorts of complications that you unfortunately see now with the coronavirus. The general high temperatures, that kind of ill feeling. But what made bubonic plague unique is the notion of inflamed lymph nodes, also known as buboes. The notion of seizures, classic things that you do not want to feel, many did between that period of time. But that was a bacterium and secreted a lot of toxins. And now to bring it closer to home, there's many types of biological toxins that generally cause harm. Botulinum, tetanus, diphtheria, these are all actual bacteria that will secrete toxins to cause harm. Now, if you think of biological toxins, is even if you think about food poisoning, so Staphylococcus aureus, Clostridium difficile, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, all of these are bacterial names that cause harm through the forms of using toxins. That's why biological toxins can be really dangerous, because we had chemical warfare. There's a huge prevalence that you could even have biological warfare, and that's quite a scary prospect to think about. So moving on to physical toxins. This is not as prevalent as it was before, but it's still useful to remember. So aspects like coal dust, asbestos, silicon dioxide can cause serious harm in terms of respiratory health, and all sorts of prevalences that we used to see a lot more back in the mid 1900s. But even though they are huge physical toxins generally seen, I'm a firm believer that even though we've seen a decrease in physical toxin exposure and harm, we've seen an increase in other toxins. Chemical toxins in particular, the amount of food chemicals that we see now, the amount of processing issues that we see now in terms of chemical toxins. It's a huge problem. I think you would hopefully agree that we have seen an increase in adverse health due to some form of chemical toxin, whether it's in toiletries, cosmetics, whether it's in food, and that has become more prevalent than the physical toxins we generally see. And it's a shame that we might have seen a decrease in one, we've seen a huge increase potentially in another one over the past 3 or 4 decades. And that's something we can try and minimize ourselves. I will be talking about that tomorrow. Now, lastly, radiation and its toxic exposure. Now, without going into some really deep level physics, within radiation, it's kind of seen as the term anything kind of gives off energy in the form of waves or particles. Now, there generally are 2 forms of radiation: non-ionizing radiation and ionizing radiation. Now, in terms of non-ionizing radiation, it's a form of radiation that doesn't penetrate past the deeper tissues, but it can cause that thermal heating that we see. So radio waves, microwaves, infrared, ultraviolet is kind of a bit of both, but those kind of lower energy emittents cause that kind of heating we see. So if you put our phone, unfortunately, next to our head and we're on a call, it will heat up. And that's the radiation, that non-ionizing radiation are carrying. Now, many people argue, is Bluetooth bad for you? Is this bad for you? I go back to that notion of accumulation. Now, if you were to constantly ring 24/7 and cause huge overheating around here, you can damage the skin and tissue, and that could lead to some form of complications. Yet, on the general principle, if you look after the way you use devices that have non-ionizing radiation and it's not too close to your body, generally I try to use wired headphones. There is a debate about Bluetooth, but the notion of minimizing your super direct contact to non-ionizing radiation is going to decrease your risk of certain complications. But ionizing radiation, alpha, beta, and gamma radiation, super scary. Now, the reason why it's called ionizing radiation is these higher energy radiations are able to affect the DNA in terms of the actual atoms and cause ionization of these atoms. So you can actually move electrons from the atomic structure and cause serious mutation that we see from high level exposure to ionizing radiation. Then we know that we've got alpha radiation, beta radiation from radioactive elements. But we know that gamma is one of the strongest and highest energy forms in terms of ionizing radiation, and we don't want to be anywhere near those forms of radiation, in particular gamma radiation. So on principle, when I think of toxins, I really do think of the body's enemy. So whether we ingest it, inhale it, inject it, or absorb it, they are some form of damage to the body. So when I come to think of a toxin, I think of how can I minimize it, how can I reduce the risk, and I'll be talking tomorrow about how can we detox and try to remove these toxins from our actual body. So I hope to see what you think of when you think of the term toxin. Do you think of a particular type or a particular toxin, for instance, or do you think about it as a whole general principle? Do you think about detoxification? Let me know. And I want to finish on a very interesting point I read in a recent paper, which is in the description box, about looking at social changes and emotional changes as a form of toxin. So people have argued the notion of social toxins, like becoming unemployed, the notion of lack of education. They can be toxic to our mental health. You know, a lack of education can be quite debilitating later on in life. And feeling unemployed or being unemployed can have a harmful effect on our general daily life. Then even emotional changes. So chronic fear, chronic anxiety and uncertainty in this very chronic states can be a form of toxin potentially, in terms of it's affecting our physical health, our mental health. And we know through our own lives that how dangerous it is when we are in those states and kind of being chronically depressed, how harmful it can be to us. So why isn't that potentially seen as a toxin? You know, we generally associate toxins, that naturally so, in terms of the correct definition, to some form of substance that we, as I mentioned earlier, inhale, ingest, inject or absorb. But it is also an argument to look at social changes and emotional changes as a form of toxic exposure, and then by definition a toxin. But it's interesting to hear what you think about that type. Do let me know in the comment section below. I'll be talking about detoxification tomorrow in episode 22, so let me know and stay tuned for that as well. Let me know your thoughts. Do like and subscribe if you can. It will be a huge benefit for me and the channel. So I shall see you tomorrow, episode 22.